not make it was Counselor Plunkett. He had a client meeting.
Okay.
The only one I heard from Carol that did not make it.
Okay, live on YouTube.
All right, we're ready to get started. So I will pull up my screen. All right, can everyone see my screen?
No, unless it's all black.
Hello?
Hey, Joe, I'm speaking to Counselor Culp on the phone. He said he's online. He can see everything, but we can't see him.
Do we know what his name is that he came in as?
Oh, man. That's a good question.
Yeah, there's a
It could be J. Culp at Scale Systems.
there's a system scale here.
That's him.
Okay.
All right, can everyone see my screen and hear me?
We can hear you. We cannot see your screen.
Okay. Sorry for the technical difficulties.
Sorry. It happens.
It's not letting me click.
Joe, are you getting ready to do some movie work there with the green screen in the background?
I
Are you going to do the
will
weather?
start and try to get this working as I go along.
It's for my TikTok account.
I'm your only subscriber, I believe.
Yeah.
Actually, let me try something. My screen is frozen. If someone in IT is handy, if they can come over to my office, that would be helpful.
Tammy, is this the same presentation that was sent out to
apologize.
counselors? You'd send a presentation out Saturday, 9:15 a.m.
I think she can hear us.
I don't think so.
Talk amongst yourselves. Let me give you a topic.
And go.
Yeah, we'll throw back.
It's locked.
I think I have that exact same background that Joe does. Wonder if he'd notice if I. There we go. That'll confuse him.
Parks and Rec, baby.
That's right.
I'm improvising with boxes. We're very technical here at the Culp House. There we go.
Is this a better background for the budget discussion?
Craig, how was Maryland?
It was great. It was great. Fun experience. Fun experience. Really
What was
was.
that all about? So I saw the pictures and things. So I'm very confused. What was that all about?
I donated to Mike Rowe's organization, the Mike Rowe Works Foundation, through an Omaze website, which entered me into a contest to win a meet and greet or have a beer with Mike in Maryland,
Oh,
paid for. So my connection was a little more, I won, they interviewed me. And at the end of the interview, they said, well, we actually called you to do this because you actually won. So I was all excited. I was on a job. So I'm a contractor running for office. Long the short of it is, he supports trade schools, and I think that there's a need for that
yeah.
locally. So that was
That's
my
awesome.
yeah, pretty cool experience. So I took somebody that might win the school board for the town of Zionsville as well. So that connection kind of just made it a little bit easier to connect all the dots for things in the future if I can get anything off the ground.
He will win, by the way. He's running unopposed.
Great.
By the way, I think we're still being live streamed and recorded. even
We
though
are.
we're
I think
having a
so.
Social conversation. Okay,
We
just
are.
so everybody's aware.
Yeah. No, I won't throw out any of my normal language.
Was Mike as cool in person as he seems to be on the show? I mean, he seems like real down to earth, like good guy, salt of the earth.
Because we're being live streamed, yeah, I'll tell you as much as I can about that event. But he was as cool in person as you could imagine. He looks like he's just on the TV screen. His voice is amazing. Like it's just like it is on TV. What a great spokesperson, potentially for Zionsville even. But he definitely, he brought his gal that's the head of the foundation with her, Mary, and she was, beautiful and talented as well with regards to the brainstorming. So very cool opportunity. And hopefully this relationship will, continue to grow.
Is he still bitter that he didn't get to sing the Back Home Again in Indiana?
I don't know that he's bitter at all. He's busy as all can be. He just met with Kim Klasick right before he met with me, and Kim Klasick's down there in an interesting area with a big race going on down there. So in Baltimore for Congress. So he's out there getting it. He's doing stuff. There's a lot of stuff going on in the future for him. You'll hear his voice for a long time and see him. What a great guy.
Just for the benefit of anybody that may be on the attendee list that's wondering why we're just sitting here shooting the bull, there's some technical difficulties going on with the presentation. So we're just kind of chit-chatting until they can get that worked out on their end. I think most of the people on that I see are panelists are work for the town anyway.
So they're already familiar with our boring chit chat.
Right.
Mike Rowe is also a huge supporter of the police and fire and first responders. So I'm just throwing that out there. That was part of that connection that you guys may have seen get sent out as well. So really special to meet with him.
Hi there. We're back. Can everyone hear me?
We can hear you.
Great. Okay. So I totally crashed my computer, but I think we're good now. So I'm going to pull up the presentation and hope that it doesn't freeze this time.
There we go.
So back to the beginning. Okay. Now we're in business. I sincerely apologize. Okay, so budget workshop. As we saw the original timeline, it was very condensed and based off of the timeline of the regular council meetings. So council has been fortunate enough to allow us additional time to go back and refine the numbers and make sure that the budget that we present in 2021 for the 2021 year, that it will be solid and that you will be happy with it. So the revised budget timeline, as you can see now, we have the second budget workshop, and then we have an additional 2 weeks to work on that budget publication for the budget public hearing on 10/19. And then the budget hearing or the budget adoption consideration actually won't be until the 29th. So a full month from today, in order for council and myself and the departments to work together in order to get to those adopted amounts that we want to see finalized. I wanted to take today to talk about some of the clarifying points, that feedback that I had gotten after the first budget workshop and the introduction. And so just want to walk everyone through so that they can understand the methodology and be comfortable with how we are presenting the budget going forward. It is back-end processing things, but I think it's important to understand how it works and what the implications are, so that everyone, again, can be comfortable with it. So when we talk about the fire operating and the parks operating going into the general fund, we're talking about the same tax base for all of the funds that you see listed in that 2020 column. And what we are merely doing is requesting that the fire and the parks can be combined into the general fund, so that we can show that all the operations of the town for that same taxpayer base are supported, and with the exception of police, because again, if you remember from the first presentation, police is supported by a different taxpayer base. And in the 2021 general fund, you can see all of the town functional areas that are included in under that general area. And so the operating costs would be covered by the general fund and the police fund. And in addition, we have that public safety lit. And if you recall, when I did that first presentation, the departments presented their budgets for what they needed, and it was agnostic of any of the funds. So it didn't have a specific this much in this fund, this much in another fund. It was just, what do you need in order to run your department? And I think that's important to point out, because as we have gone through this process, our estimated amount of the local income tax revenue had changed from when we started to when we ended. And one of the questions that council asked was, well, how does that change what was presented so far? And at that point, we had just presented the department amounts, right, their budgets. And so the answer was, there is no change, because that's what it costs to run the departments based on the information that we had at that time. And so when we're looking at the general fund, fire fund, and the parks combining into that general fund, that doesn't change the amount that it costs to run an organization. All it does is give the town additional flexibility in order to find the funding. So the department's job is to run their operations, to do the best that they do for the citizens of Zionsville and for the visitors and anyone that comes to Zionsville. My job as CFO is to find the funding for those priorities. And so by looking at it as, you know, what does it cost for each of these departments, I think that helps to clarify how we are then working through this budget process. So the main sources of revenue for the general fund, the fire fund, the parks fund, and even the bonds and things like that are property taxes and the local income taxes. And so the same money is going to fund the same operations as we know it, right? So it's just on our end in the back office on how we allocated it currently. So there were some additional concerns about the cash that is in each of the funds right now and what would happen to those funds. So I'm going to go through in a little more detail on the fire and then the parks separately, and just talk through some of this information after I go through some general considerations. So again, nothing is changing, that council will still appropriate all funds of the town, right? Whether it's the general fund or the parks fund or the fire fund or all within the general fund. council still is the fiscal body of the organization, and they determine the amount that will be authorized up to that amount to spend. Any changes to increase, decrease, or transfer appropriation from one department to another will still require council action. So we're not going to put the fire department into the general fund and then use that money for administration. So those actions will still go before council just like they do today. The goal is to increase the efficiency, and the revenue is currently allocated to the different funds within the same tax base. And so right now it's a back end exercise for us to go in and allocate that with, when we look at the general fund and you look at all of those departments and functional areas that are within the general fund, we already can kind of take whatever cash balance and divide it by either using the budget. We can get a number for the amount of spend or compare it to cash already for these other departments, because these other departments don't have their own fund, right? We're all the town, we're all in this together. So monitoring and reporting on cash balance reserves is also a key in moving this into the general fund. So right now, like we said, property taxes is the main source of revenue, is paid twice a year. So when you're looking at cash flows and being able, in my office, to be able to say how much to invest of that money, of that cash balance, right now we would have to look at 3 different funds. And you can see in the next point that the pooled amount for investment right now, you would have to have 1 additional investment fund for each of the existing funds. So if we wanted to have a general fund investment, we would have to have the general fund, the normal account, and then we would have a general fund investment. If we wanted a parks, we would have a parks and then a parks investment. If we wanted fire, we would have to have a fire and a fire investment. From a reporting standpoint, that's a little bit tricky, especially in the public, when they might look at just the general fund line because the other fund is in a different bank account on page 3, then they wouldn't necessarily see those together as one and be able to make that connection, and it might cause some confusion and some misinformation. So what we want to do is we want to streamline the information so that we can better report on it and better invest and use that information together in order to do better things for the town. So the sustainability plan is also very key in going forward, and to make sure that everyone understands how the town works together in order to fund and to see those priorities. So on a sustainability plan, we would have each of the departments and each of the funds listed out. We're looking at revenues, we're looking at expenses, and we're looking at cash balance. Any capital investment plans, priorities, the council, the mayor, the departments, all of that will be combined into one plan for the next year's budget. So during next year, we'll work on this plan and we will present it with the budget so that you can better see that we are planning for a fire station or we have a specific park capital need. And those will work together in relation. So you might see the fire department has more expenditures than revenues in a certain year. And then the next year, the parks has a greater need. So all of that balances out over the years, and we'll be able to see that and track it and monitor it. So going specifically on the fire department, the Fire Cumulative Fund 208, I want to make sure that it's clear that that will remain a separate fund. So that is the cumulative capital replacement fund for capital needs and equipment. And that serves a different tax base. So that one is required to be separated out. That one also has a maximum rate that is set. We did find out that we do not need to reestablish that every year in order to maximize that rate that goes into the total tax rate. So that one will be reestablished at the maximum rate so that we can make sure that the equipment needs of the fire department for that specific taxpayer base is called out. And again, the council will still appropriate all funds, including the fire department, within the general fund if we move to this new structure. And again, any changes to increase, decrease, transfer appropriation from one department to another will still require the council action. The pooled cash balance in the general fund 101, it can be used for the personnel, operating, capital, debt service needs of any department in the fund, including the fire. So another one of the benefits, as we were talking about with the sustainability, is that you're not looking at just one cash balance and then saying, well, we don't have enough cash in order to do that project, therefore we have to cut your budget, or you can't do that project, right? So we're going to look at all the funds and look at it as a whole, as this is the town and we are providing for the residents and the visitors of Zionsville. We will also be able to track budget to actual appropriations by department. One of the other comments that I had heard was that the departments, they wanted to make sure that they were still held accountable, that, you know, they had a budget that was approved through a council of X, but they saved, you know, $30,000 here or whatnot, and that they would still be able to say that they saved that money. And we do not want people, just because they have the appropriation, to spend the money. We want everyone to be fiscally responsible, because that money that does go back into the general fund and the other funds, it is used when we're looking to decide if we, you know, how much we can reward the employees, or looking at capital needs, if we can fund projects. So every year we do want to underspend those appropriations to the extent that it makes sense, in order to still provide maximum services for the residents. The cash balance transfer from the fire fund 207 to the general fund, it will be earmarked for fire capital or debt service purposes. So one of the things that I had heard was that the current cash balance in there, it was the intent was to save it up for buying down a fire station, or to be used for capital needs. And so we still want to honor that. So through a council resolution, when we're transferring those dollars, we will earmark the amount that is being transferred as revenue. With the new financial system that we're proposing, we will also be able to track the revenue based on the department level. That is currently not an option in the state portal, the DLGF portal, and it's not possible to easily see that in our financial system currently today. And so when we make that transfer into the new system, we will be able to see that that was fire department specific revenue that came in. Just like when we get ambulance revenue, that would be coded to the fire department, planning department revenue would be coded to the planning department. Knowing that not all of the services of the town are supported by fees, that a lot of it is tax-based services. So going on to the Parks Department, when we're looking at the Parks Department, they also have some special funds. They have a non-reverting operating fund 214 and a Parks non-reverting capital fund 215. They will remain separated out because there's specific statutes that govern the use of those funds. So again, we're not changing anything with the non-reverting accounts of the Parks Department, only the operating one. So where the personnel costs come from and any of the other major categories. And council will still appropriate all funds, including the parks. The Parks Board will still approve claims from the Parks Department activity in the general fund and the other funds that have Park Department appropriations, including the non-reverting funds. So again, there's no change to claims processes or anything when we're talking about the transfer. And in the DLGF Gateway forms, you'll notice that on the Parks Department, it has Parks Department and in parentheses Parks Board, just so that it's crystal clear on the authority of processing the claims. Appropriating the amounts, again, is the council authority. So the council decides every year how much to appropriate for all of the funds, and that does not change. Any changes, again, to increase, decrease, or transfer to the appropriation are on the department level. So again, we're not going to be using the parks money and the parks appropriation for other needs without going through council. But it does give us the flexibility in order to meet the needs of the departments on that cash side with our paydays of the property taxes, again, twice a year, and then with wanting to invest money as well, and to have that a goal to bring more money into the town. And council can still elect.
Tammy, could I
Yes,
ask you a question then?
yes.
This is Alex Joy. When we're talking about the cash balance transfers from the fire fund or the parks fund to the general fund and those being earmarked for those specific purposes, when things are cash balance, then as part of the general fund for parks, do those go into those earmarks as well, or does that transfer get spent down to zero and then there is no parks purpose cash balance funds?
So how I envision it is that the transfers would come in as earmarked revenue. And then as the departments have specific needs for that, we would track on how much of that earmark has gone down, right? And again, the council is the one that is appropriating every year, and that isn't changing. But for example, we would probably have enough in order to just put that money over in investments. So that would be the easiest way to track the information of the cash balances, is to just put it in an investment fund, just like we have currently with our rainy day fund that it's invested. And then we would use the additional, because it's between the general fund and the general fund investment, as the total amount that State Board of Accounts and DLGF, the regulatory authorities, are looking at. And so I think that would make sense to me in order to do that. But again, we would just track it and be able to say that this much was put aside, and then these are the uses that we're going to use those on. And we can put that in the sustainability plan in order to paint that clear picture for everybody, so that everyone has that comfort level of knowing where those dollars went.
Okay, so there will be one cash balance in the general fund, but it will be divided out in a sustainability purpose into
Correct.
different areas then. So we
Correct.
won't have three separate funds, a single fund, but there will be earmarks for that cash balance.
Yes, exactly.
Okay.
Mhm.
Tammy,
Great question.
if we didn't do this
Mhm.
for whatever reason, what impact would that have on our ability to fund the current budget as proposed, if any?
I would need to look back at the numbers, but I believe that those cash balances have been accumulating over time, and that the savings and the appropriations of the local income tax and the property taxes. So with those allocations, it's not it's more of an art, right? So if we have a budget of $1 million in parks, we would move $1 million of property taxes in order to meet it, right? So there's no real reason why those allocations are the way that they are, except to fund the budgets. And in the cases where departments wanted to in the past save up for things, then they would have additional money put over into their fund in order to then show that savings. But with the way that we plan on showing the full picture with the sustainability plan, that's no longer necessary. So, and I think that's the mentality change that will need to happen, is that we are supporting the departments of the town and the services that they are providing. And once you identify those needs, then we will then come at the back end and show the funding for it. Either, maybe we need to increase revenues, decrease expenses, but in order to get to where the departments are. And so those allocations, we would just adjust to answer your question. We would just adjust those allocations in order to meet the budgets of the fire department and the parks department, because every year those allocations can change.
Sure. I guess the question is, if the fire department was somehow has accumulated this money, right? Call it $3 million a year, whether that was actively communicated or passively communicated, and the budget is going up, in this case by $400,000 because they want 2 tankers. That, like, the rest of that cash goes into the general fund. Is it not being used to fund other requests that are coming in by other departments?
Are you talking about in the general fund? So the tanker thing
Yeah.
is actually a little bit confusing, because that's actually in the the fire cumulative fund.
Okay, so take that out. So let's just say the fire. So in that case,
So like
then
the increases due to the performance increases.
yes, yeah. So the how much is the fire budget, I guess, going up, if you will? You know, I was trying to look for that, but
Yeah,
all I
it
had
would have been
was just
on the second presentation on one of the slides. I don't have it pulled up right now.
hold on, I can bring it up. I know it's the second one. Hold on, sorry. So
And-
okay, so
and again-
fire's going up $345,000.
in the fire general.
It's a general
within
expense estimate.
Now, that might not be how much they are actually going up, because you would have to look at that with the public safety lit. Because again, the allocation changes year over year based on the available funding and how much we want left over at the end of the year, the operating balance of that. And that's where this municipal finance gets a little bit tricky, is that there's a lot of pieces that go into getting to that number. So we would need to look at the 2020 budget and look at the public safety lit plus the fire department budget and compare that to the fire department and the public safety lit for 2021 in order to get an accurate comparison of how much their needs to run their operations have changed.
So, all right. Is that something that will, so layperson here, right? Like you're a CFO for a town, you live and breathe this. I'm a counselor that sort of shows up once in a while and asks a dumb question. But in my mind, we are transferring $6 million from targeted specific budgets to the general fund that, as you listed, could go to any one of 15 things.
Mm-hmm.
So putting on my corporate hat, I now have $6 million more to quote unquote play with that can be dispersed in amongst other departments, which, okay, that is what it is. I'm having a hard time of sort of like if we don't do that, does that mean now the general fund has $6 million left? How does the budget support that if there's now not this cash balance there? Does it mean that the general fund is, well, I guess that's where it starts getting really confusing. I don't know where this money is going and what's happening to it. Like it just sort of seems like, oh, well, you know, it's a foreign mail, it's a thing, it's a lit, it's you know, it's all in there. But then when I say if it's not in there, well, it doesn't really matter. So it just seems like this money's got to go somewhere. How's it being spent? Or is it just being put in the savings account for future spending?
It's being put in the savings account, to answer your question. So over $5 million is in the cash balance currently for the general fund, for instance.
Yes.
I think the last fund report was 5.8 million, right? And then we have $1 million in the rainy day fund. And so when I'm talking about being able to be nimble, I'm talking about taking the cash balances, pooling them together, fire, parks, and general, and then being able to invest those dollars so that we can then come back and make more money or make other decisions. And looking at the sustainability plan instead of looking across 3 different funds to fund priorities. So say we have a parks department need that exceeds their cash balance or exceeds what we're comfortable with them spending out of their operating account, because we do want to maintain those cash balance reserves, which there's a policy right now for 15 to 20%. Those amounts we want to be able to invest, but instead of having to go across the 3 different funds and figure each one of those individually, because right now the general fund can be used for parks purposes, right? We can budget for a parks project in the general fund. And
we can or cannot?
We can.
Okay.
Because it's the general fund and it supports, that's the same taxpayer base. And that's all we're doing, right? We're just moving it so that when you're looking at a sustainability report, instead of flipping 3 pages and looking at 3 individual cash balances, you're going to look at just the general fund because it's supporting all of those activities. It's simplifying things for a layperson so that when you're looking, it's all of what's different about the operating fund, general and police and fire from police. Well, police has a different taxpayer base. What's different from the cumulative fund? It has a different taxpayer base, right? So having those split out and then having to answer, well, why is the allocation for the local income tax, X percentage this year, and then why did it change next year? well, we looked at the cash balances, and based on the rate of spend from this year to next year and the revenues from this year to next year, then doing all those calculations that this is where we wanted our cash balance to land. It's a lot more to explain than this is the general fund. It supports the town activities, and these are the uses for it.
So under that, guys, then, or that scenario, the general fund goes from 5.8 million in cash to how much is the parks and the fire? Another 5.5?
Yeah.
roughly?
I think
So it goes to 11.3 plus the rainy day fund. And that's the extent of it, right? It's not being used, because I know that we're shifting, we'll talk about this a little bit, we're shifting from kind of a surplus budget to a negative budget this year for various reasons. We're not, that shift is not being funded by this shift necessarily, correct?
No, that is correct. That is correct.
You made a mention about being able to pool these to invest. If we didn't pool them, we could still invest. We would just have 3 investment accounts.
Correct. We would go from having 3 funds to 6 funds versus 2. And then we would again, because you have troughs, and when you're looking at monthly spends, we'll have an increase in revenue in January, and then it will get spent down February, March, April, May. And then when we get that next distribution, then the cash balance goes up. So if you take that for one fund, then you can only invest at that lowest amount without having to do a bunch of back end work. If you take the 3 funds, then you can invest more and have more flexibility going forward.
So to that extent, then, with the proposed budget, we can get to this, you don't answer this now. Is there a cash flow statement that says how much cash is coming in and how much cash is going out in 2021?
So that would be the underestimated revenues and the overestimated expenses on the revenue and expense lines. So I will have that for the next presentation after we've gone back and revised some of our numbers now that, or as we go through and finalize some decisions, like the engineering one, which we'll talk about in a little bit. There's definitely revenue and expense implications that will change, and that we'll be able to move forward based on those revised numbers.
And when's that next presentation, going back to the calendar? Is that council meeting the 5th?
So
or the 9th, I'm sorry.
The 19th. So the forms will be done in the 2 weeks before the 9th. And so I will send council updates and the points so that I can make sure that we're on the same page. But that will just be the advertised amounts at that time on 10/9. So that is just the 1-page advertisement. So we'll actually have until the 19th to work on what the council is comfortable adopting. And that will be based on some of the activities that will be happening in the meantime, including financial system, if we're going to use CARES Act money for that. So that will be on October 5th. But if that is approved, then we can cut $175,000 from what was advertised on the budget to what is proposed as adopted. And then that will help cut into that deficit so that the deficit isn't so large. Activities such as that.
And just, I want to make sure I'm reading this correctly. So looking at the budget estimate for the general fund, given that the fire and parks are going to be earmarked for just specifically their uses for that transfer, the rough math I'm doing is that if you don't count that as revenue, I know you, for accounting purposes, you do, but if you don't count that as revenue because it's earmarked for something else, then we essentially have a $3 million deficit in the general fund, year over year.
And when you say year over year,
well, I'm looking at like our estimated cash balance at the end of this year in the general fund was 5.8 million. With the 5.5 million that is being deposited into the account, we get up to an estimated 8.3 million at the end of next year. So I'm just backing out, that 5.5 million from that 8.3. So you're getting roughly, if you don't, count that as revenue because it's earmarked, then we're basically income and outgo. We're about $3 million in the red. I mean, we've got the balances to do it.
Mhm.
I'm just making sure I'm looking at this right.
Yeah, and we will go over the detailed numbers here in the coming weeks and via email and public presentation and things like that, to be able to refine and to make sure that everyone's on the same page with that information.
Okay.
So we were talking about parks and
Sorry, Tammy, I'm trying to get past it. But Brian made one statement. I just want to make sure that that is true, and maybe it's that last bullet point. So is the $3 million that's currently in the fire budget as it gets transferred to the general fund, it says will be earmarked to fire expenses, present or future?
so are you talking about fire department?
Yeah.
Okay. So on the park or on the fire department, we're talking that for fire capital or debt service purposes. And so the intent that I had heard for those dollars were for capital for actually a fire station.
So is earmarked just a point of reference for future budgets? I mean, there's nothing to earmarking it, right? The mayor or council in a year could propose we want to use that money for cotton candy day if we wanted to on the town, right?
It would require council action in order to change the use of those funds. If we do include in the resolution that those funds will be earmarked. So we will make it.
Okay, so earmark has some teeth to it. It's not just we'll probably.
Correct. So we will make sure
okay.
that there's a resolution and an audit trail for that. So, and that's why I proposed that whenever there are those capital needs that were identified that this money was to be saved for, that we then take that off of the amount, right? So if we spend $500,000 of this for fire department, survey, engineering, that kind of thing, then we would take that off of that amount and then keep track of that year over year. And the sustainability plan would be a great place to do that, because that would, again, make sure that it's forefront of that we did this and why we did this. And then we can see that amount go down over time as it is used for the purposes that it was intended for. And then council always has the ability to set that amount per year on what is going to be spent no matter what. And so the same theory applies when we talk about the cash balance transfer from the parks fund to the general fund. It'll be earmarked for parks purposes. So less specific than the capital, because this might include having it for a capital expense that might need operating associated with it. So that one we don't want to pigeonhole too much, but as Parks identifies and we get a new park superintendent shortly, they can help refine that information and then be able to move forward. And in the same idea of having the fire department line in the sustainability for this earmarked cash balance, we would also have the same for the parks department as this earmarked amount, and then that would get drawn down as the intent for uses used in that. Are there any other further questions on the parks and fire fund transfers into the general fund? Okay. So another question that we want to make sure that we addressed and is the engineering in-house scenario. So the assumption of hiring a director of engineering and engineering one, which was included in the original budget, which is that $260,000 of the public works salary increase, includes the max benefits. Again, if everyone were on the family plan, and that would be the total all in for what is hitting this budget in the general fund or in the MVH fund in this instance. So the updated fee schedule, we would also need to include so that we can then capture revenues from the activity that the in-house engineer is doing. And then we also have the pass-through engineering that is happening currently. So this is a lot of information on one slide. So I want to walk us through and make sure that everyone understands this scenario. So if we look at 2019, you see that there's a budget of $75,000 that was appropriated by council during the budget season. And then the 2019 actual spend was $417,000. In 2020, we had a budget through the budget process of $100,000. And then the year-to-date spend so far is $411,000. In 2021, in the budget form ones that you got, which shows all the detail per line item, in that planning engineering line, there was $600,000 in that line. It was not called out as a highlight because that's how we were doing business already. But as far as when you're looking at a 2020 budget to a 2021 budget and just looking at those budgets, it is a $500,000 increase from 2020 to 2021. Now that was on the basis of not knowing if the engineering positions would be actually hired. They wanted to make sure, the planning department, that we had enough in the budget based on actuals in order for the invoices to flow properly without having to go to council again for additional appropriation authority or transfers. If we hire the two positions, engineering positions, planning is estimating that the expense for third-party engineering would only be about $250,000. So same activity in 2021, but instead of using third-party engineering for $600,000, we would save $350,000 by going to this in-house engineering model. And then that $250,000 would be specialty or maybe time frame issues and things like that, that we would still find use for third-party engineering services. On the revenue side, yes.
When you're looking at the planning engineering expense change, and I'll use 2020 budget of 100,000 as an example. When you're talking about year to date, is that 311 above budget or 411 above budget? Have they already spent the 100,000?
Yes, great question. We have spent 411,000 to date. So the amount over the appropriation would be 311,000. Great question.
Okay, that makes me think that the 2020 original budget of 600,000 is above and beyond. Oh, year to date.
Correct. That is not.
So we have a few months left. So,
correct.
Okay.
Yep.
I see.
With 3 more months. Yes. And again, those are, we don't know how much the development community is going to come in next year, but based on trending and what we've seen in the past, we do still expect it to be strong. And as we do process efficiencies and a new permitting system that will go before you again on the 5th, that those kind of enhancements would hopefully incentivize developers to come to the town of Zionsville more and to do business. So that 600,000, again, we want to overestimate on our expenses to make sure that we don't have to go before council again to ask for an additional appropriation. When you're talking about the general fund and the fire fund and the parks fund, anything that is levied with a property tax or has a tax implication, we do have to go the public process of advertising in the papers, which costs money. Going before council, we would do no matter if it was a tax levied fund or not. But there are additional steps for additional appropriations when we go through this. So that 600,000 is supposed to be a high number that we do not anticipate actually meeting. And then on the revenue side, you normally budget the revenues lower so that you make sure that you hit those numbers so that there's no surprises. So when COVID came about, then as long as the revenues were estimated low enough, then it doesn't impact your revenue versus expense picture as much as it would if you had said, I'm going to get 100% of my revenue 100% of the time. Looking at that planning engineering revenue change, this reimbursement has not typically been included in the budget. And if you can look at 2019, we received $349,000 in 2019 and $313 so far year to date in 2020. The billed amount on that $600,000 would be about $570,000 in revenue. When we go to an engineering in-house scenario, the development community has been paying at that level before. We will still have third-party engineering expenses, but we will also have our in-house engineering costs of the overhead, like the $260,000 just for salary and benefits. There's also soft cost involved with the hiring, which are training and things like that. But the revised estimate of the $570,000 would be, again, if we're at that $600,000 level, then we would be at $570,000 up to that amount, depending what is passed at the end of December for the 1/1/2021 fees. And so again, this is not a sure thing because this has not gone before council yet. So it would just be a guess as to what those revenue amounts would be. For revising the budget, the $600,000, if we do go to an in-house engineering, the $600,000 is probably high because we would plan to have those engineers do the costs that those third parties are doing. The $250,000 is probably a little low because there will be some ramp up time in order to get the engineers familiar with our processes and to start doing that work for the development community. So when we refine our numbers, you'll probably see an estimate somewhere in between the $600,000 and the $250,000. The same goes for the revenue side. It won't be zero and it won't be $570,000, but it will be some amount in between the two so that, again, we can feel confident that we will meet those numbers, but without having an artificial number like the $600,000 if we do go to the engineering services. So if you look at the original budget plus what we had planned that we would get back that wasn't included in your budget forms, then you would be looking at a $30,000 deficit of what we were paying out versus what we would receive back in reimbursements. If you look at the revised estimates of engineering 1/1 and the fee schedule 1/1, everything up and running, then you have the $250,000 of expense plus the $570,000 of revenue. So you get a net revenue increase of $320,000. So if you take the two of those, then we're up $350,000. Now we do need to take out the expense of the engineers with the personnel costs. So that's the $260,000. And if you look at the net revenue of $350,000, then we would have a net savings to the town of $90,000 in year one if everything were up and running January 1. I'll give you a moment to absorb that and let me know if you have any questions on it.
That makes sense.
Great. And then from the council's perspective, are there any hesitations on hiring the two engineers so that I can use the correct numbers when we're doing the budget?
I think for purposes of this meeting, you should do the budget as the other pieces of the budget have been, which is assuming that what is being asked will be done. And then if there's discussion, questions, changes later that come from council, we can just back it up.
Great. That'll help out a lot when coming up with the revised numbers on the proposals. So thank you for that. So in addition to the planning department engineering costs, there's also the public works department impact of it. So again, if we hire the director of engineering and the engineer, then based on the past 2 years of activity, the town would have saved about $124,000 because of the work that we have been previously outsourcing to what we can insource today. So with that director of engineering and the engineer one, if you look down at the Excel sheet below, you can see the work that the engineers in-house would be able to do at 100%, and then some that they would do a partial amount and then outsource another portion of it. So again, we're not saying that this in-house engineer will do all of the engineering work, but they will do a lot of the activity that we had previously been outsourcing. And in the motor vehicle highway and the street department public works budget, the savings is not reflected because again, we don't know what's going to happen one year over another with what requests are going to come in from the development community that we will have to take on. So you can see in 2019 that there's 155,000 was all that these activities did, but in 2020 there's 346,000. So it varies wildly from year to year in some of these engineering costs and things like that. So in motor vehicle highway, for instance, I believe there is an increase proposed for the engineering cost despite having savings opportunities, and that's just not knowing what we don't know at this point. Does anyone have any questions on the engineering in-house scenario? Okay. So those are the areas that I wanted to focus on today, as those were questions that we had gone over before. Again, I want to stress that when we look at the budgets, that the departments are giving us what it costs for them to run those organizations, those functional areas. And then on the back end, we're matching up the revenues, but being conservative in our revenue estimates to provide, knowing that for the past few years, we have been receiving an additional local income tax revenue that has not been included in the budget in the past. The other revenues that we just discussed had not previously been in the budget, but we will add them for this. My team is going through and looking over those expenses and making sure that, again, that we have the best estimates on both the revenue side as well as the expense side. And we're looking for those opportunities that we can, as decisions are made, be able to reduce the amounts from the adopted columns in order to get to a lower deficit amount. I will say on the presentations that were done before, they were rushed in getting those numbers pulled in, and it was a manual process. With a new financial system with tied to reporting, that should be a lot smoother and more accurate, because the more manual work that we do, the more chance of errors. So those, the overall numbers for the revenues and expenses, the revenue amount for the property tax was actually using the advertised amount instead of on the proposed adopted amount at that time. But those numbers will all be revised in the coming weeks, and I will communicate those to you, as well as get a good guide on what is making up the deficit, as well as the increase on the budget side from 2020 to 2021. As we're finding a lot of the things in the 2021 or in the 2020 budget, there's several areas where the actuals from 2019 are coming over to that they were under budgeted in prior years, and we are making sure that the numbers that we have for 2021 are accurate to make sure that, again, that we don't have to come back to council here and there to ask for additional appropriations or transfers.
Tammy, as you explain that process and you think about department heads thinking through their priorities, their long-range plan, maybe things communicated to them by the mayor, things communicated by the council. They may come back with kind of, as in any kind of budgeting, here's my wish list, right?
Mhm.
Was there a process where that wish list was pared down, or was just the budget provided with all they wanted? It was put together, it was looked at to see what funds were available. There was a delta that turned into a deficit, and the idea is council is supposed to break up that deficit or accept that deficit, or is this the pared down version? Do you sort of get what I'm asking at?
Yes, yes. There were requests made that after talking to mayor, deputy mayor, that they were not included. They were not very many, and they were amenable to the departments and understanding, and that was just based on priorities and information that we knew at the time. And so there was a internal review process for that. Again, we have things in the budget for process improvements and other things so that the departments are able to take advantage of the flexibility of the growing town and to be able to make sure that we can be as efficient and serving the public the best that we can, especially with COVID and the restrictions that we have. I will touch on that we are trying to utilize our CARES Act money from the federal government that is passed down to the state. And a lot of the, several of the budget line items, as I mentioned, the financial system being one of that, is included in the 2021 budget, but we are working in 2020 to make those purchases to alleviate the pressure on the 2021 budget. So those we plan to remove as we go through the process of getting approval for purchasing of those. And so again, another consideration from 2020 to 2021 is of capital needs. And in the past, there have been encumbrances from one year to the next for some small amounts here and some bigger amounts there. But I am trying to get the departments and the council to look at a year's budget of what we expect to spend in that year. And then that is the budget that the council will see, because those are the dollars that will be coming out of our pocket in 2021. And so when we're looking at one year against another year in the future, we should see more accurate representation of actual spend and needs in the years without having to go back for additional appropriations as has been done in the past. And so trying to refine that, because a person from the public who's looking on the Gateway site, which is the state transparency portal, right now, they do not see the additional appropriations or the encumbrances included on that budget amount. So when you're looking at a line item and say, for instance, that we go back and on the engineering in-house for planning, they see the $100,000 budget, council passed an additional appropriation or did an encumbrance from the prior year for $400,000, right? And so from our standpoint, that everything's in the black, but when they look at the spend of the town and then they look at the budget that was approved, they're going to see a deficit. And then that's going to start misinformation and things like that. So we really want to get everything into the budget, the annual budget process, so that we can better anticipate and to be transparent to the public.
Tammy, so getting back to Councilor Traylor's question earlier, and correct me, Councilor Traylor, if I'm wrong in this. So we're looking at having a budget that has a significant deficit in it. Is there a way to, and you and I've talked very briefly about this, is there a way to tease out the things that are cyclical versus in it, so that we can look at, are we running a deficit when we're looking at how we operate the town? So,
Right.
from year to year, are we able to support the town, and is this deficit because we have some things that we've saved up for that we're going to be spending, like the roundabout, those kind of things? Is that what you were getting at, Councilor Trailer?
That is correct.
Wonderful. So yes, for the next presentation or before I can send out some information, but there are one-time capital expenses for when I was just looking at quick, at least $2.3 million is capital expenses that are new capital expenses. For instance, the roundabout that is proposed of over $1 million there. So those kind of expenses and calling those out when we're showing that slide, I think is important for the council members as well as the public in order to understand what's driving that. So we're building a roundabout this year, but next year we might not, or maybe we get a grant. So those kind of things are definitely something that we need to take into consideration versus the ongoing operating costs. The sustainability plan, again, will show and take into account the new personnel as well as the increases assumptions on those new personnel to make sure that when we go out 5 years, that all of that is sustainable and watching that cash balance. And we will also be able to look at our capital needs and be able to space those out appropriately across the years in order to meet all of the needs of the departments. Great point.
And then one other question was, I know that you and I talked about this briefly, but if you could talk again about the legal expenses for town council and the administration and the increases in that on the administrative side of it.
Absolutely. I actually had a slide on that, and then when my computer crashed, I did not have it available to pull up. But basically, the short story on the legal expenses is in 2019, the actual spend, this is another scenario where the actual spend exceeded the original budget amount. And there was $566,000 that was spent in 2019 on legal expenses. And that was for a town-only attorney. In 2020 and 2021, we have a town attorney retainer as well as a town council attorney. And so when you take that actual spend from 2019 and you add the $186,000 of retainer, additional retainer, then you get to about $752,000. And we had in the 2021 proposed original budget, $745,000. So it's an increase of the additional council retainer as well as an increase based on actual from 2019. And the same scenario that we are at with the building department engineering, when we have a budget of $375,000, we are already over that budget in 2020. In the previous years, there was $225,000 that was additionally transferred into those legal lines in order to meet those obligations so that the actual would then the budget amount would increase to get to that actual amount through a transfer resolution in 2019. So when we're proposing additional spend, like the $600,000 compared to the $100,000 or the $745,000 compared to the $375,000, we're looking at it based on actual information. So again, we don't have to keep coming before council, but we want to tell you at one time, this is what we expect to spend on these lines in 2021. So, I mean, an example would be we're showing a deficit today. You know, if we didn't put in the engineering costs or the roundabout costs, then it would make the picture look a lot better, but we would have to come before you and do an additional appropriation. And we want to be as transparent as possible for both council and for the residents of Zionsville and put together a proposal that is accurate and that will go before you that you can understand.
To that legal fees, are we having so we're having $100 and some odd $1,000 increase in legal fees above 2019 because administration and town council are retaining two separate attorneys.
That's correct.
I'm trying to
Well,
think.
we had a attorney in 2020 too, right? So it's not
Correct.
an increase.
But
from
it was
20
not
to
included in the
2021.
budget.
Yeah, that's what I was getting
Right.
at. It's the budget item. But so I know it's not completely additive, but having two retained attorneys now instead of one for the whole town as a global entity back in 2019 versus having two retained attorneys, one for town council and one for the administration or the town. Shouldn't the cost of each retention be less? Not completely additive? Do you see what I'm getting at? I guess this is not a budget question, it's more of an operational expense question.
It's I suppose perhaps more a philosophical question, I think, to what Tammy was talking about earlier. But a year ago, we effectively were sharing the same council, except for when the town had specialized needs, then there was extra counsel that was brought in, but it was never budgeted, and so we have to do reallocation. And I think also a lot of things we just were didn't have time to get to. It is, I think, as you noticed, busier for us as counselors, and I'm sure it is busier for administration. We can certainly talk about it anytime, Councilor Choi, but it was probably something long overdue to make sure that each respective side of administration and legislative has the right counsel for them for priorities when priorities don't align. How's that for a political answer?
That was very good.
That was
Thank you.
very, yeah, that was very
I-
diplomatic.
Uh-huh.
Yeah,
I've been married a long time.
yeah.
Well, I appreciate everyone's time and sorry about that. So if there are any questions, feel free to reach out to me. I've enjoyed talking to the council members that have been able to meet so far, and just to get to know everybody better, as I've only been here a few months. So that's been nice, and to be able to share the municipal finance world with you all.
Just one quick thing for me. Last workshop, it was stated that there was not a line item for the Chamber of Commerce in the 2020 budget. And I went back, I didn't say anything at the time because I wanted to make sure I was right, but I went back and looked, and there was in fact a line item for the Chamber of Commerce coming out of the Food and Beverage Fund. That is very important to me. The support of the chamber and support of Z-Works. I think they're both very worthwhile organizations. And I don't think that we can expect them to be able to ask for funds on a quarterly basis going forward when they have to do just like we do and budget annually. So pretty important to me that at least those two organizations, if not, and especially, ZYSA, because they have not been funded to date, even after we approved it for our 2020 budget. But, those organizations, along with Boone EDC, are important to make sure we continue to support. And I would really like to see those organizations in the budget for 2021. That's it.
Great. And I can't.
I would kind of echo that to the extent that I still need to, as far as my being a counselor and supporting those organizations, I've had a chance to meet with the chamber and the Z-Works, but have not had a chance to meet with ZYSA to I'd like to understand, as far as Boone EDC goes and ZYSA goes, understand, I don't know if the other counselors would as well that are new, but what the value add they bring to the community is. And so I just don't want to make an assumption around the value add to the community. And so I would echo that to at least a partial extent from Councilor Traylor's point.
And just so you're aware, Alex, the ZYSA will be at our council meeting on October 5th just to give a presentation. So they'll be able
great.
to give you information about what the value add to the community is.
Yeah,
Brian.
yeah. And my
go
kids
ahead.
played ZYSA for a little while too, so I understand, but a formal presentation would be nice as well. Especially Boone EDC. I do not really understand them at all at this point.
Brian, my understanding is the chamber for 2020 did receive their funding, but your point is about the other organizations and for 2021 figuring out what they can budget for, correct?
Correct. I'm not worried, 2020 is 2020. I'm worried about going forward. They need to budget for themselves as well. And if we're not willing to give them advance, approval, then it's kind of hard to do that.
Yep, that makes sense.
I would like to make a clarification. I believe in the last meeting that it was stated that the committee would meet quarterly. It was not stated that that funding would be given quarterly, that someone would have to apply on a quarterly basis. So I do want to make that clarification. And the idea is not to stop funding the levels that we are. We just want to have due diligence for the citizens. I have spoken with the mayor, and I don't want to commit her to anything, but I'm sure she'll reach out to everyone here shortly. But as we're going through this process of setting up this new grant committee, then we are looking to meet the commitments of 2020, and then that would also be possibly for some of the organizations in 2021 as well. So I want to make sure that it's clear that this is not an effort to stop funding the organizations. It's to make it more of a process to where other entities would also have equal opportunity to apply.
Tammy, if they're meeting quarterly, and I'm anxious to see guidelines, I'm sure the mayor and staff are working on them. If they're meeting quarterly, will there be any effort to front load the grants themselves? In other words, I'm expecting most of those organizations, whether they're the ones that Vice President Traylor mentioned or others, would be coming at that first meeting looking for some sort of commitment to do their budgets. And then the remaining money would be on sort of an ad hoc, as someone had an event that they'd like some help on, kind of like what the chamber did with the Night on the Bricks. So if that's not defined yet, I think it should be something that should be taken into account so that, if the chamber asks for 50 grand and the committee decides to grant them 35 grand, they know that at least going into their budget process and can, potentially ask for more later, I suppose, but it would be good for them to know, I think, for any organization to know what they could expect and when, so they can plan accordingly.
Absolutely. And yes, we could make the decision in 2020 to fund the chamber for 2021 as well. So that's not out of the question at all. So we are looking at that and able to move forward. But I agree with you in that as the funding becomes available, or not as it becomes available, but as the requests come in, that those decisions would be made at that time.
Makes sense.
Yes.
I guess the other question then is, how do we relate, or how does this function in comparison to other communities around us? Do they also line item support certain organizations, then have a nonprofit grant committee to fund other organizations? What's best practice around the communities in the area or in the state? I guess that's more of a question to be delved through later, but something I'd like to know.
Yeah, I mean, as with anything, things change in a year, right? So even with any of the budget line items, that if you set out with one, pool of money and then the priorities change within the year, And so I think the idea is that as the needs come in and are requested, that we look at it more like that instead of just a standard number going from that. But yeah, that will definitely be discussed as we go forward in the process. Are there any other questions at this time? I know there'll be more as we go through this process, and I will continue to share information and clarifications on anything. Hopefully you found this helpful in diving into some of these specific items and getting more clarification around them. So if there's anything else like this that you'd like me to present on or to deep dive into, then I'd be happy to do that.
Appreciate it, Tammy. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
All right.
Bye, everyone.
Bye.